Thank you for joining us today for Mastering NPOs and NGOs, an essential guide to understanding registration, legal, and compliance requirements in Belize. My name is 𝐢𝐧𝐜𝐤𝐬, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. We are thrilled to have over 590 registered participants, which highlights the importance of this topic for many in Belize. In recent months, the Financial Services Commission, the regulator for non-banking services, together with the Belize Companies and Corporate Affairs Registry, the registry for all legal and business entities in Belize, have been leading an educational campaign to raise awareness about the nonprofit organization legislation, which was recently enacted, as well as the long-standing legislation for the non-governmental organizations. In July of this year, the FSC and BCCAR held a series of in-person sessions across the country, which attracted over 300 participants. These sessions sparked important discussions and raised key questions, which we have documented. Today, we aim to provide further clarity and guidance to these questions. This webinar, Mastering NPOs and NGOs, an essential guide to understanding registration, legal and compliance requirements in Belize, is a part of an ongoing series of educational initiatives that the FSC and BCCAR are executing. We encourage you to ask questions, share your thoughts, and provide feedback throughout the session as we continue our efforts to equip you with all the necessary information to successfully register and manage your NPO and NGO in Belize. Before I introduce our expert presenter, I would like to review the process for question and answer. Throughout the presentation, we ask that you place your question and direct them, if possible, in the chat to the regulator, the registry, or presenter. Representing the regulator, the FSC, we have the Director of Legal and Enforcement, Ms. LaDonna John, and the Director of Compliance, Ms. Charlene Jones. Representing the registry, BCCAR, we have the Deputy Registrar, Mr. Santiago Gonzalez. These are the individuals who will answer the questions during the Q&A along with the presenter. If there are questions that require more time or further elaboration and time does not give, we ask that you submit these questions to our email address, communications@belizefsc.org.bz. We will place this email address in the chat. Throughout the webinar, you will also see different poll questions, and we ask that you participate so that we better understand if we're being clear on the different components of this topic. It is an honor to now introduce our expert presenter, Melissa Ferguson. Melissa Ferguson is a highly experienced professional with over 18 years of legal experience in public and private sector. In the public sector, Melissa worked for Companies of Jamaica, the regulatory body for companies and other business entities in Jamaica, where she held progressive roles of legal officer, business registration manager, and acting deputy chief executive officer. In the private sector, Melissa held the role of manager of legal and corporate affairs at the Caribbean Cement Company Limited, a subsidiary of the global conglomerate CIMEX and publicly traded company with one of the largest market capitalizations on the Jamaican Stock Exchange. Melissa is also a tutor for company law at the University of West Indies and Law Association at Norman Manley Law School. She is currently the principal and founder of 𝐭𝐨𝐸 Consultants Limited a company that specializes in corporate and regulatory compliance and training and development. Melissa, welcome. Thank you for accepting the invitation to be our expert presenter for this very important topic. And I now hand over the floor to you.
Thank you for that warm introduction, Ms. Yuri. It is my pleasure and distinct privilege to be here with you this morning to share on the topic Mastering NPOs and NGOs, an essential guide to understanding registration, legal, and compliance requirements in Belize. Before we go, I just want to share the agenda. So we've already gotten through the opening remarks. We will look at first the nonprofit organizations, then the non-governmental organizations, followed by our live question and answer segment. Just a brief overview of what you can expect to see throughout the presentation. With respect to nonprofit organizations, we're going to start by defining what is an NPO. We're also going to examine the various legal structures which NPOs are allowed or permitted to take under the NPO Act. We will also take you through the very important topic of registration of NPOs, and additionally through the requisite compliance obligations, having successfully registered your NPO. Without further ado, let us start by defining what is an NPO. And the definition of an NPO is contained in the Nonprofit Organizations Act. And based on that legislation, the NPO is defined as a company or a body of persons, whether incorporated, unincorporated, a trust, or other legal arrangement. So you'll see from the words I've highlighted here that the NPO can take a variety of legal forms. What is significant is, though, it must be more than one person as evidenced by the word a company or a body of persons. Now, the definition goes further by focusing on three key aspects. Firstly, it speaks to those bodies of persons or legal arrangements, which I mentioned earlier, established primarily for the promotion of certain prescribed purposes, those being charitable purposes, philanthropic purposes, religious, cultural, educational, social, or fraternal purposes. The definition also looks at those entities so organized which benefit the public or a section of the public within Belize or elsewhere. To zoom in on the criteria with respect to public benefit, I want to point out two key things. Public benefit, in the legal sense, encompasses two main aspects. It encompasses the aspect of benefit as well as the public. In relation to benefit, what needs to be present and demonstrated in an objective manner is that the activities and the programs of the NPO must do more good to the community than harm. So the good must outweigh the harm. Also, we are looking at the public aspect, meaning who is benefiting from the programs or activities of the NPO. And what is required legally is that a sufficient section of the public or the public at large benefit from the programs or activities. So it's not just sufficient for a very small number of individuals to benefit from the programs or activities. It has to be more far-reaching than that. Additionally, the definition focuses on a third criteria, which are those organizations which raise or disperse funds within Belize or elsewhere. Now, with respect to raising of funds, the raising of funds involves several activities. It could be the request for donations and contributions from the public, or it could involve the hosting of an activity by the NPO which requires an admission fee to be paid. It also includes things such as marathons, walkathons, dinners, galas, just to name a few. What is also important here with respect to raising funds is the definition of funds as encompassed under the Money Laundering and Terrorism Prevention Act, which is a very wide definition which takes into account funds, all funds, however derived, whether it is tangible or intangible. Right, so I want you to remember those three criteria with respect to the definition of an NPO. This will be significant in assisting you in determining whether or not your organization is required to be registered under the NPO Act. Let's move now to a brief overview of the Nonprofit Organizations Act, or the NPO Act. So the Act came into effect last year on the 13th of May, 2023. It provides a risk-based supervision of NPOs in Belize and is part of Belize's global efforts to combat terrorism financing and money laundering. Now, the most significant thing about the Act is that with the passing of the Act, NPOs which are either unregistered or at any period after becoming registered, which has had its registration suspended, cannot do two key activities. These are soliciting contributions or having contributions solicited on its behalf, or raising funds or having funds raised on its behalf. So it's key to understand that with the passing of the legislation, these activities are now prohibited unless an organization which falls within the definition of an NPO under the Act are registered and has a current registration throughout the lifetime of the NPO. Let's now look at who is the NPO registrar. The Director General of the Financial Services Commission is the Registrar of NPOs. The Deputy Registrar of the Belize Companies and Corporate Affairs Registry, BCCAR, is the Deputy Registrar of NPOs. The legislation, however, refers to both collectively as the registrar. You will, however, note that there are distinct roles and functions which are performed by either entity. Let's continue by looking at some of the powers of the registrar. And these include accepting and reviewing of applications for registration and the setting of fees for applications for registration. Followed by the powers are a few functions, key of which I want to highlight are the administrative as well as the monitoring and oversight functions of the registrar. The administrative functions are geared towards the maintenance of an updated register for the benefit of the public, and the legislation prescribes the information which must be contained on the register. With respect to its monitoring and oversight capacities, the registrar is empowered by the Act to actively ensure that NPOs are complying with the NPO Act and that they remain free of illegal and unwanted influences. Let's zoom in a little bit more on these administrative functions, some of which include the receiving and reviewing of annual returns, the receiving and reviewing of audited financial statements, the imposition of sanctions by an NPO for breach of its obligations, and the registration, maintaining of a register of NPOs containing prescribed information. I want to spend a little bit more time, however, looking at the monitoring functions of the registrar, which are key under the legislation. Firstly, the registrar is empowered to conduct or authorize on-site inspections. Likewise, the registrar may conduct or authorize inquiries into the operations of NPOs. The registrar may also make reports to and liaise with the FIU, the DPP, the DPP, and law enforcement agencies where there is suspicion about money laundering. The registrar may also cancel or suspend registration of NPOs. Let's take some time now to look more closely at on-site inspections. So on-site inspections of NPOs have commenced, and some of you may already have received notification that an on-site inspection will be conducted by the registrar. Let's take a look at some of the key activities which are permitted by the legislation during an on-site inspection, as well as the records that the registrar is interested in viewing when such an inspection is carried out. So the following permissible activities are entry of the NPO's premises, inspection of the premises, observation of the conduct of the operations of the NPO, the inspection of any recorded information found on the premises, taking copies of or making extracts of any information which has been found, and requiring any controller of the NPO to provide an explanation of any recorded information or to state where the information may be found if it is not present on site. What can you expect when the inspectors are present? The inspectors may perform an assessment of the financials and record-keeping measures to ensure that appropriate records of donations are being kept, and that these also include records of disbursements and information on the persons entitled to receiving funds from the NPO. When we get to the compliance obligations section of the presentation, I will take you through in greater detail of what these financial and record-keeping measures are, so that you are better sensitized as to what it is that you ought to be doing. The inspector may also wish to determine whether the NPO has adequate knowledge of terrorism financing abuse of NPOs and whether the organization has received training. They will also seek to assess the NPO's understanding of how the organization may in fact be open or susceptible to terrorism financing abuse. Now, there are some key resources which provide more detailed information on the terrorism financing abuse of NPOs, and these are highlighted on the screen. So the Best Practices Committee has actually compiled a document, but in addition to that, there is in fact best practices which have been indicated by FATF, which is a global standard setting body when it comes on to NPOs. And so I've highlighted on the screen here what the URL addresses at which these presentations may be accessed. When you get access to this presentation, you will be able to view these presentations. So these are additional resources that NPOs may want to get access to in order to get a broader understanding of the NPO's risk to abuse for terrorism financing. And the third slide is the actual local best practices, which has been provided by the Best Practices Committee, and it is to be found on the FSC's website. You will get access to the presentation, which will allow you to access those resources. All right, so we've gone through so far through the definition and the registrar of NPOs. At the beginning of the presentation, I sensitized you as to the fact that NPOs can take a variety of legal structures. I want to spend some time now giving you further insight into what these legal structures look like, as well as the constitutional documents which govern each legal structure. Before we do that, though, I wish to highlight for your information that NPO is a status granted to organizations and is not a structure within itself. So it is key to remember. So before you can actually apply for this status, the organization must exist, whether as an incorporated or unincorporated structure using one of the one of the many NPO structures which is permissible by the legislation. NPOs can adopt a variety of legal structures, and the legal structure which each NPO decides to adopt will be specific to their needs, how they work, and their membership. These legal structures can take the form of an incorporated structure, meaning a structure which has been registered pursuant to a legislation and which has been granted separate legal personality. Or it could take the form of an unincorporated structure, meaning that it's a body or association of individuals who have come together for a collective purpose, but they are not registered pursuant to any legislation. They do not have separate legal personality, nor do they have limited liability. Let's take a look at the unincorporated structures. And there is the association. Now, many persons may be in fact familiar with the association. This association is formed by means of a carefully drafted constitution, which will outline how the association is to be run. It will contain the key rules which are important in the day-to-day running of the association. So in preparing a constitution for an association, persons want to ensure that the constitution, is well thought out, and that it is also comprehensive with respect to things which are of key importance, such as who are the members, how are the members to be determined, how are decisions to be taken, will it be taken by a committee of persons, and if so, how are those persons to be appointed? How are meetings to be held? What constitutes a quorum for a meeting? Just to give a few examples of the pertinent points for an association. There is also the general partnership, and the constituting document for this is a partnership agreement. Then there is the trust, which will be evidenced by a trust deed or other instrument which sets out the terms of the trust, for example, a will. The incorporated structures are those mentioned earlier, which are formed pursuant to some legislation. There are the international foundations, and the constituting document would be the foundation charter. The company, which most individuals would be familiar with, which would be constituted by its articles and bylaws. And the articles and bylaws of the company would contain many of the same things I mentioned before with respect to the Constitution. It governs the management of the organization as well as the day-to-day running. So all the rules which you would wish to be applicable to your organization need to be stated in your articles and bylaws. Then there is a limited partnership, which, like the general partnership, is evidenced by the partnership agreement. And finally, there are those incorporated structures which we term as bodies corporates. And these are entities which have separate legal personality, just like companies, but they are formed via statutory instruments or acts of parliament. And there are several bodies that are so formed. One common example is churches. Many churches are formed as bodies corporate through acts of parliament. And the relevant document evidencing that entity would be the Act of Parliament, which has been gazetted. All right, so we've covered the variety of legal structures. And before registration, an NPO would want to give careful thought to which entity best suits its needs as well as how it operates. Let's move on now to the key aspect of registration. Having been sensitized as to the variety of legal structures, you then want to proceed to having your NPO registered. Now, before we get into the actual registration steps, let's look again at the organizations which require registration under the NPO Act. This is very important. Again, those established primarily, and the word primarily is very important, for charitable, philanthropic, religious, cultural, educational, social, or fraternal purposes. So we're looking at the primary purpose of the organization. Why does it exist? It must fall within one of these prescribed purposes in order to be in a position to seek registration under the NPO Act. We use the word primarily because we are looking for some degree of permanence to the activities of the organization. So we're not looking for a one-off or transient occasion or event being put on by a group of persons. We're zooming in primarily on those activities which have a degree of permanence, which falls within any of these prescribed categories, as well as those which benefit the public or a section of the public, which I explained before, who is considered to be the public, as well as who raise or disperse funds in Belize or elsewhere. So these three criteria must be present in order for the organization to be registered as an NPO. Which entities typically seek registration? There are the charities, the service organizations, the community service organizations, sporting and recreation associations, art and cultural education institutions, as well as religious organizations. And this list is by no means exhaustive. It is just an example of those entities which would typically be seeking registration based on the definition given under the Act. Now, the Act treats the requirement for registration in two ways, depending on whether the NPO was in operation before the commencement of the Act or not. NPOs, including NGOs, which by NGOs I mean non-governmental organizations, which we will look at further down in the presentation, which were in operation immediately before the Act came into effect, but not registered as reporting entities under the Money Laundering and Terrorism Prevention Act, were given a grace period within which to register in order to be able to continue their programs and activities. And this was a 3-month registration period. The registrar recognized that this period was not sufficient for these entities to actually be onboarded, and so the grace period was extended by the Nonprofit Organizations Extension Order until March 28th, 2024. Now, this date has already passed, and so by now, all NPOs which fall within the definition of the Act should in fact be registered, as no further extensions of the grace period are in force. Registration, as I mentioned earlier, is key for NPOs to continue to solicit funds or raise contributions from the public. Now, let's look at those entities which were registered as reporting entities under Section 85B of the MLTPA. NPOs and NGOs which were so registered are deemed to be registered under the NPO Act. And this simply means that they are not required to complete a brand new application for registration. The registrar may, however, notwithstanding that these entities are deemed to be registered, may request that either an NGO or an NPO submit additional information to the registrar in order to ensure that the entity is compliant with the registration requirements as set out under the NPO Act. And so it is important that if your organization falls within this category, that when a request for further information is made by the registrar, that the request is complied with. As NGOs or NPOs which fail to provide the additional information requested by the registrar may have their registration suspended or canceled. And of course, a cancellation would mean that the NPO or the NGO is no longer entitled to conduct its operations lawfully. Right? So please remember that. Before we get into the actual registration process, you may ask, why do I need to register, other than the fact that the legislation stipulates so? What are the benefits to me of registering under this legislation? You are encouraged, rather, to register under the Act because it increases public trust and confidence in your organization. Persons have greater trust and confidence in organizations which have successfully registered following the procedure under the legislation, and may be more willing to deal with those entities and also to provide grants and donations. So there is in fact greater access to grants and donations by registered entities. In fact, there may be some organizations which have a policy against donating to organizations which are not registered. So you don't want to miss out on those opportunities for grants and donations which will enable you to conduct and carry out your programs and activities. It also provides opportunities for networking and collaboration. And this networking and collaboration can open doors for increased resources for an NPO who may be on a very small scale and may not have access to certain resources, such as critical training that may be of importance in enabling the NPO to become more efficient in the administration of the programs and activities, but also in remaining compliant with the NPO's obligations under the legislation. And we're going to look at in a little bit what these obligations are and the implications of not complying with these obligations. So again, you don't want to miss out on these opportunities for networking and collaboration to enhance the skills and training of the officers of the NPO. It also fosters increased visibility and outreach because as a legally registered entity, there will be no hesitation in advertising and putting out your programs and activities so that members of the public can become more aware of your presence and the programs and activities that are available to them. So having sensitized you as to some of the benefits that you may not have given thought to, and I want you to remember these benefits, let's now look at the procedure for registration. How do I become registered as an NPO? And when I say I mean your organization. So it starts with the submission of an application to the registrar. And the NPO application is actually contained in a prescribed form, which is contained in the schedule to the NPO Act. The application form is also accessible through the Belize Companies and Corporate Affairs Registry. So that completed application must be submitted together with a copy of a valid ID of the controller of the NPO. And I will define in a little bit who a controller is of an NPO, together with the fee of $100. Now, once you submit your completed application together with your supporting documents, the registrar goes through a review process of your application in order to determine whether your application meets the requirements of the NPO Act. Having reviewed, the registrar has a discretion as to whether to grant or to refuse registration. If the application meets the registration requirements, the registrar will approve the application and he will enter the NPO in the register of NPOs and issue a certificate of registration to the NPO. If, however, an application is found wanting with respect to the requirements of the NPO Act, then the registrar will communicate within 21 days of his decision to refuse the application by issuing a notice to the applicant, providing written reasons for the refusal. So you will know exactly what has been identified as a shortcoming of the application, so that you can take remedial steps to correct the application and resubmit, so that the registrar can again review the application so as to have the entity registered and to issue you with your certificate of registration. You will see on the screen an image of what a certificate of registration looks like. You will see the registry's name, the Belize Companies and Corporate Affairs Registry, the act under which the entity is registered, and the statement that the Belize Companies and Corporate Affairs Registry certifies that pursuant to the NPO Act, all the requirements with respect to registration have been met with. It will bear the seal of the registry, the date on which the registration was done, as well as the signature of the deputy registrar. We have, for the purposes of the presentation, just omitted the name as well as the registration number, but the name of the NPO will also be displayed, as well as its registration number. And this will be your proof that your NPO has been successfully registered pursuant to the NPO Act, and that you have the NPO status. Now let's look at who is a controller of the NPO, because I did mention that the application must be signed by the controller and that the controller's ID must accompany the application. So a controller of an NPO is the person who controls, owns, manages, or directs the NPO. So we're looking for the individual who is key in making certain decisions and who directs the NPO. Now, depending on the legal structure which the NPO takes, this individual may take one or more forms. So for example, it could be a trustee, it could be a director of a company, a general manager, a manager or administrator of an unincorporated association, or in any other case, the person who manages and controls. So that is key. Who manages and controls your organization? That person will be deemed to be the controller of the organization. And sometimes we don't want to get caught up with technicalities as to what the person is called. So I have mentioned here, based on the legal structures, what the individual is typically called. But the fact that you are not so called does not mean that you do not classify as a controller. Key is who is managing, directing, or controlling, or who ultimately owns the NPO. Let's take a look now at the contents of the registration application. Applicants are required to provide the following information in their application: the name of the organization. And the name of the organization is significant because it's a part of your identity. But there are certain rules governing the types of names that can be used. So for example, the name of an organization seeking now to be registered will not be approved where it is similar or identical to the name of another registered organization. So one of the things you may want to do before you actually submit your application is to make a check with the registry by doing a name search to ensure that the name by which you wish to be registered is actually available for registration. All right, and there are other rules, such as the fact that the name cannot be offensive or immoral. So please pay careful attention to the name. Neither should the name be misleading. All right, so the name of the organization conforming to the rules with respect to names, ID, addresses, contact information of the controllers, and in addition to the controllers, the members of senior management. Copy of particulars of trust deeds, if applicable, or other organizational documents. Copies of your constitution, your memorandum, as may be applicable, depending on the legal form which the NPO takes. Also important in the application is the declared purposes of the NPO. And these declared purposes must be stated as clearly and explicitly as possible, because this will enable the registrar to make a determination as to whether or not the organization seeking registration actually falls within the prescribed categories as set out under the NPO legislation. So be as straightforward and it's as explicit as possible, so that the registrar does not have to wonder or consider too much on whether or not you actually fall within the prescribed purposes. Information with respect to the location of funds of the NPO, as well as the anticipated source of funds or contribution, is also important. How will your contributions be used is another item which is required to be addressed in the application. Any other evidence indicating your organizational structure. So if you do not have any of the documents that I mentioned previously, for example, a constitution or a trust or articles, but you have some other document which clearly sets out your organizational structure, then you should also submit that to the registrar with your application. The proposed geographical area of operation of the NPO. Where are you located? That will be key, because of course the registrar has to keep in his register information on your address. The financial year of the NPO is also significant, and the financial year will be important for determining when your annual return is to be filed. And in the compliance section of the presentation, I will elaborate a little bit further on your annual return, what is to be contained in it, and so forth. All right, so those are the key aspects of the application. Please take care in completing the application form to ensure that you are as detailed as possible and that you complete all required sections. Now, having registered your NPO successfully and you're in possession of your certificate of registration, it certainly does not end there. There are varying compliance obligations or duties which are set out under the NPO Act, which are required to be complied with by all NPOs. Let's take a look at what some of these are. So the first that I wish to highlight is the notification of the cessation of operation or change in purpose of the NPO. And this is required to be done by the controller. So a controller of an NPO which has ceased to operate or is no longer in existence must, within 30 days of the NPO ceasing to operate, communicate this information to the registrar. Also of importance is any change in the NPO's purposes and activities. Remember that you would have stated on your application form the purposes and activities that the NPO is engaged in. And so if there is any change in these purposes or activities, the registrar has to be communicated with. Again, because the legislation prescribes certain categories of activities which must require registration. So the registrar needs to be kept up to date so that the register can be kept up to date as well as if your constitutional documents change. So for example, you made an amendment to your articles or your bylaws or to your constitution after you did your registration, it is pertinent that within 30 days of that change taking place, that you also communicate that to the registrar. Now, I just want to highlight here that notwithstanding that entities such as companies registered under the Companies Act may have taken steps under the Companies Act to notify the registrar of those changes, it is also important that, notwithstanding that the registrar is one and the same, that the necessary information also be communicated to the registrar under the NPO Act. So remember that notwithstanding that you've done it under some other legislation by which your NPO structure is registered, you also need to communicate the change under the NPO Act. Let's take a look now at your annual returns. NPOs must file an annual return each year, and again, it is used in a prescribed form, which is the NPO annual return form. This annual return must be filed within 4 months of the end of the NPO's financial year. So here we are again seeing the importance of stating the NPO's financial year accurately, because the filing of the annual return is dependent on the ending of the financial year, and it must be filed within 4 months of the end of the year. Now, this annual return also carries a fee, and that fee is $100. Now, there is some further information to be filed in addition to the annual return. So after great consultation, the proposal by the registrar is that the financial information to be provided together with an NPO's annual returns should be determined on a tiered basis. Let's look at the first tier. So for income under $150,000, the annual return is to be accompanied by financials, which comprise of an income statement and a balance sheet prepared by an accountant or bookkeeper. Where, however, the NPO's income is greater than $150,000 and less than $500,000, then the NPO is required to submit internally generated financial statements consisting of income statements, balance sheets, cash flows, which must be certified by a senior officer of the NPO, for example, its financial controller or its senior accountant. On to the third tier, which is NPOs with income over $500,000. Now, the proposal is that these financials must be audited annually, and it must be by an auditor. The implementation of these proposals is most likely to take place towards the end of the year into the beginning of 2025. So what do you do in the interim? In the interim, until an order is made, NPOs should file financial information prepared by its accountant or its bookkeeper. So remember, not just the annual return that should be filed, but also the financial information of the NPO. In the interim, same can be prepared by an accountant or a bookkeeper. But with the implementation of these proposals, which is most likely to come into effect towards the end of this year into the early part of next year, then you must be cognizant of the tier within which your income falls to determine the appropriate means by which the financials ought to be certified or audited or generated. Right? So that is significant. All right, so moving right along. So having filed your annual returns, whether current or any outstanding annual returns, NPOs are in a position to obtain their certificate of good standing. You will see on the screen an image of what the certificate of good standing looks like. Again, we've obliterated the name and the registration number for privacy, but you will also see a QR code to the left bottom corner, which will give access to more information with respect to the NPO. Now, your certificate of good standing is evidence to your partners, financial institutions, whoever the NPO deals with on a regular basis, that it is compliant with its legal obligations under the NPO Act, and it is in fact in good standing. So you want to ensure that your annual returns are filed on time and that they are complete and submit and accompanied by the necessary financial information to put you in good standing with the registrar. Let's take a look at some other compliance obligations. NPOs must maintain accounts and other records in relation to its business. And accounts and records here include financial records. If you will recall, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that during an inspection, the inspectors may want to see the financial records of the NGO, indicating the contributions which have been received, the donations which have been made, but also other records with respect to the identification of the beneficiaries. So you want to ensure that you put in place measures that facilitate proper record keeping and the preservation of your records. Because under the legislation, an NPO is required to preserve its accounts and other records for a period of at least 5 years from the end of the financial year, or in the event that the NPO is cancelled, 5 years from the date on which the registration was cancelled. So it's important that if your records are in a form that may not be transparent or legible after a period of time, that you take steps, for example, to digitize them and ensure that you have that backed up and stored somewhere. Should, in the event that your actual records get destroyed for any reason, you still have access to your records, because the account and record keeping requirement is very significant under the Act. And of course, for those NPOs who are required to conduct audited financials as well, your accountant, your auditor, your bookkeeper, they're going to want to see the actual records from which to generate your statement. So it's key that you maintain this information, but also that you preserve the information. NPOs are also required to implement internal accounting and administrative procedures to ensure the transparent and proper use of their records. So the NPO must ensure that there are certain internal controls in place to ensure that the funds that have been received on behalf of the NPO for the purpose of fulfilling its objects, its purposes, its programs and activities are used in a manner consistent with the objects and purposes. Also want to ensure that there are certain checks and balances in place to protect the NPO from financial abuse. So for example, one best practice is having the annual budget of the NPO approved by the governing body or the committee, and also having that governing body or committee have checks and balances in place in order to ensure that the funds are being spent as they had been approved. Additionally, there could also be signing mandates on accounts, for example, setting a threshold with respect to certain transactions and indicating that certain transactions above the threshold require the signature of 2 or more individuals in the organization, just as a check and balance. So it's very important that these measures are documented, but also that they are observed to ensure transparency in the operation of the NPOs, as well as in the proper use of the NPOs resources, financial and otherwise, because again, your resources may be financial or they may be non-financial resources. NPOs are also required to take certain due diligence procedures. Now, NPOs must take reasonable measures to confirm the identity of each person to whom the NPO or through its associate services has provided support or assistance valuing no less than $500. And that the persons assisted are actually involved with or using the assistance. They're not using the assistance to in turn support terrorist or terrorist organizations. So again, after the funds have been disbursed to the beneficiaries, you may want to make some checks to ensure that the funds have in fact been received by the identified beneficiary and also understanding who your beneficiaries are. So you know whether or not you are at risk for abuse through your programs or projects or activities to terrorism financing abuse. So it's very important that these steps actually form a part of the administrative processes and procedures and that they be adhered to. Now, having sensitized you as to what your compliance obligations are, I want to point out that failure to discharge a duty imposed under the Act constitutes an offense to which a person who is found liable on summary conviction may be liable to a fine of $3,000 or to imprisonment or to a term of 1 year or to both. So it could be that it's a fine or imprisonment, or it could be both. So it is important that you understand what your duties are under the Act and that you comply with these duties. Additionally, where the NPO registrar discovers breaches on the part of the obligations that an NPO is required to comply with, he may take certain steps. He may first issue a written warning. He may also issue a directive to the NPO to comply with specific instructions or order regular reports from the NPO on the measures it is taking to comply with its obligations. And these are some of the softer measures provided for by the legislation. Where, however, it is apparent to the registrar after an investigation that the controllers of the NPO, without reasonable cause, have failed to comply with the provisions of the Act, an administrative penalty of $3,000 may be imposed on the NPO. And in cases where the breach continues after same has been identified by the registrar and communicated to the NPO, then the NPO may be liable to pay a further penalty not exceeding $100 per day. So again, you want to ensure that you are on time with your obligations and that you remain compliant. Should you have any challenges, I would recommend that you stay in close touch with the registrar and that you communicate, because again, this is a partnership. And I'm sure when you hear from the speakers from the FSC and from BCCAR, that they will say the very same thing. Stay in contact with them. Don't shy away because you have a challenge. It is best to communicate what your challenge is and see what, if any, assistance can be provided. You should also know that where an NPO, after an investigation, it has been proven that, again, without reasonable cause, the NPO has failed to comply with the provisions of the Act or pay any prescribed fees, the registrar can, in fact, cancel or suspend the registration of the NPO. So we have come to the end of the NPO presentation. Just as a check to ensure that I have been clear in some of the things that I have communicated, we're now going to take a few poll questions. We invite you to participate in the poll by selecting the appropriate answer, after which I will announce what the results of each poll is. Right, so by now you should be seeing the first poll question.
And for all participants online, I just wanted to clarify that we will continue with our webinar. We've only just concluded the section on NPOs, and we will now dive into NGOs. And I know some of you have been asking, what's the difference? Are they connected? If I'm an NGO, does that mean I'm an NPO? So hopefully, in listening to Melissa explain NGOs rather in Belize, then we can start understanding that connection. So I encourage you to tune in, listen, and of course, drop your questions in the questions section. Thanks.
All right, so we're just waiting on the poll results. Yuri, can you confirm if the first poll result is now in?
Apologies, kind of the FSC support team kindly confirm. I'm only seeing the questions. Oh, apologies, I am seeing the results. Would you like me to read them out?
Sure, go right ahead. Thank you.
Right. So the first poll question goes, Help Us Save the Environment was registered as an NPO on December 31st, 2023. Its financial year is from January 1st to December 31st. Its annual return with financial information is due to be filed by, and the options are A, April 30th, 2025, December 31st, 2024, and C, June 30th, 2024. And we have 47% of our respondents indicating the first letter A, option A, April 30th, 2025, as that due date. We have 30% indicating June 30th, 2024, and we have 29% indicating December 31st, 2024. So the majority chose A, Melissa.
Okay, and A is in fact the correct answer, because remember that your annual return due date is directly linked to the ending of your financial year, and it's 4 months after the ending of the financial year. So for those of you who may not have selected the correct answer, just remember financial year, end date, the annual return is due 4 months subsequent to that date. Thank you, Yuri. Can we look at the second poll question and the results?
Yes. Donations from the members of an organization are considered fundraising for the purposes of the NPO Act. Is that question true or false? And 80% responded true.
Great. I am happy to hear that. It tells me that persons were in fact very attentive and that the presentation was also very clear.
Indeed.
All right,
indeed.
can we look at the third question?
Which of the following activities does not require registration under the NPO Act? A football club. B, a one-off barbecue to raise funds for an individual medical needs, which we do see quite often. C, a community association, and D, a church. And 92% selected B, a one-off barbecue to raise funds for an individual's medical needs. Sorry,
Thank
93%.
you.
That is.
93%. I am indeed happy to hear that. Yes. So again, to reiterate that the NPOs which need to be registered need to meet certain criteria. So it must not only fall within the prescribed category, but also there must be a public benefit aspect to it. And remember, when I spoke about public benefit, I zoomed in on the public aspect as well as the benefit aspect. So we're asking, who is the public? An individual, one single individual, is not a sufficient section of the public in order to fall within the public benefit definition. And again, there is also no permanence to this activity. It's just a one-off activity. So something like this would not require registration. However, if it is something that is being done on a continuous basis for the needs of other individuals who perhaps fall within a certain class or category, then registration will then be required. If funds are being raised, if it falls within the registered prescribed category, and there is that aspect of public benefit. So I'm happy to see that persons are in fact following and that they understand the requirements, re-registration under the NPO Act. All right, I think that's a good point now, Yuri, for us to segue into the NGO presentation so that persons can have an appreciation of the difference between an NGO and an NPO. And then we'll see if you have an understanding of the connection between both. Thank you for your participation. Let us move now into non-governmental organizations. So we'll first by defining what is an NGO, look at registration as well as compliance requirements. The Non-Governmental Organizations Act, or the NGO Act, provides the registration and compliance regime for NGOs in Belize. Now let's take a look at how the Act defines NGOs, because just like there's a definition under the NPO Act, there is likewise a definition under the NGO Act. The definitions are, however, very different. The NGO Act defines an NGO as an organization with the following attributes and characteristics, and I'm going to take you through each one on the list. So first and foremost, it must be a company limited by guarantee. And I just want to highlight here this specific type of company structure, because if you will recall, when I looked at NPOs, I indicated that the legislation provides for a variety of legal structures that an NPO can take. On the converse, with respect to an NGO, there is only one legal structure that is permissible, and that is the company limited by guarantee. So please take note of that key distinction between an NPO and an NGO's legal structure. Let's now go through some of the other attributes. The organization must be independent of government, controlled in its operations and management. Its aims, objects, and purposes must be carried out on a charitable or a non-profit basis. Because it's a company limited by guarantee, its affairs must be managed through a board of directors. Also important is that no personal gain or profit from the property and the funds of the organization can be obtained by any member of the board, officer, or employee. Activities carried out in Belize must be in agreement with the principles and provisions of the Belize Constitution. The aims, objects, and nature of the NGO must be in agreement with the protected principles which are set out under the preamble to the Belize Constitution. So we're looking at the Constitution as a whole, but also zeroing in on those protected rights under the preamble to the Constitution. In addition to being in agreement with the Constitution, the NPO's aims, objects, and nature must also be in agreement with fundamental human rights, such as those set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and regional treaties to which Belize has agreed to abide by. And finally, and also of key importance, I must add, is that the aims, objects, and nature must contribute to what the legislation defines to be sustainable human development. Let's take a look briefly at what is sustainable human development, as well as the categories, some prescribed categories of activity under the legislation, which amounts to sustainable human development. So there are two components. There's a sustainable development and the human development aspect. Sustainable development is concerned with meeting the basic needs of individuals, particularly those who are poor, not just for the current generation, but also for future generations to come. So basic needs: food, shelter, housing. Human development, on the other hand, goes a little bit further by looking at providing better opportunities for people to achieve a longer and healthy life, as well as access to certain resources, knowledge, and acceptable living standards. Now, the Act identifies certain activities which are considered to be sustainable human development. I will highlight a few in the interest of time, but again, when you get access to the presentation, you can actually go through each category. Firstly, the promotion of primary and secondary health care, sanitary standards, and health education. Human rights. Development of educational systems for basic needs. Public education on the Constitution of Belize. The development and implementation of community-based projects for communities and marginalized groups. The provision of microcredit schemes for income-generating projects. Formation of civil society organizations concerned with marginalized groups and disadvantaged social groups. Participation of women in national development, gender awareness issues and sensitivity. Protection of the Belize culture and culture of other ethnic groups in Belize, as well as improvement of the natural environment. All right, so having set out the legal framework for the structure, having looked at the definition of sustainable human development, which, as I indicated before, is one of the criteria which must be met in order for an organization to be classified as an NGO, let's look at the process of registration. Now, before we look at the process, let's look at what the legislation highlights as some of the benefits of registration under the Act. So I'm sure a lot of persons will be happy to hear that registered NGOs are exempt from the payment of income tax. Registered NGOs, however, may apply to the Minister of Finance for exemption from other taxes such as business tax. Other benefits include the fact that monies and any interest earned on monies by NGOs involved in management and disbursement of monies on credit for projects to individuals or community-based groups will not be liable to taxes and duties. Also, funds held by a registered NGO in a foreign currency account maintained in the NGO's name in Belize are also exempt from taxes and duties. There is also benefit not just to the NGO, but also to donors of the NGO. Donors are also eligible for tax relief. Registered NGOs can also associate with any other NGO within or outside Belize to form associations, federations, or networks. Who is the registrar of NGOs? Similar to the registrar of NPOs, the registrar of NGOs is the Director General of the FSC and the Deputy Registrar of the Belize Companies and Corporate Affairs Registry. And together they carry out the functions of the NGO registrar under the Act. Let's take a look now at how the legislation treats the requirement for registration under the NGO Act. So the Act provides for the mandatory registration of certain entities and the optional registration of other entities. Mandatory registration is required by all internal NGOs operating in Belize whose programs of activities fall within the definition of sustainable development who have not received an exemption from the minister. Likewise, any association, federation, or network of NGOs which have been registered under the NGO Act must also be registered. On the other hand, all other organizations who desire to be registered as an NGO may opt to do so, provided that they meet the NGO criteria as set out in the Act, which we would have covered earlier. You should, however, know that notwithstanding that registration is optional, only registered NGOs may lobby for their own interest or represent the interest of other NGOs. What is the procedure to be registered? Now, the procedure for registration, again, starts with the submission of an application. This submission is, however, different from the submission for an NPO registration. An application is made to the Deputy Registrar of the company's registry. However, it is done so through the Online Business Registration System, or OBRS. There is no fee for submission of an application. When the application is submitted, the registrar, the deputy registrar, will determine whether the application meets the requirements of the NGO Act. And if it does, there will be an approval and the registrar will issue a certificate of registration. If the application does not meet the requirements of the Act, the registrar will issue a notice to the applicant providing written reasons for the refusal. You will see on my screen a copy of the Certificate of NGO Registration, and just to differentiate it from the NPO registration certificate, you will pay attention to the legislation under which the entity is registered. So likewise to the NPO registration certificate, there will be an indication that the entity is registered pursuant to the legislation, but in this case, it will be the Non-Governmental Organizations Act. In the bottom left-hand corner, you will see a QR code, which is similar to what you saw for the Certificate of Good Standing, that can be scanned to access further information with respect to the particulars of the NPO. And it is, of course, signed by the Deputy Registrar. Now, registration is not only possible for new entities. Existing companies may register as NGOs using the OBRS online system. Existing companies will, however, need to indicate that they are performing an amendment to their articles to commence the NGO registration process. Right? So both new and existing entities are facilitated using the OBRS system. Let's take a look at the requirements for the registration application. So it must contain the name and address of the NGO, brief details of the aims, objects, and purposes of the NGO, the organizational structure of the NGO, including details of its management, its membership, how directors are elected, the accounting and management procedures of the NGO. The names, addresses, and occupations of each member of the board of directors of the NGO or each year where applicable, the types of programs that the NGO intends to carry out for the year, and the maximum annual estimated revenues and grants of the NGO. So having successfully registered, what are some of your compliance obligations? And in looking at compliance obligations, there are some that are annual as well as some that are short-term post-registration. So let's take a look at what some of these are. Let's start with the annual obligation, which is the obligation to file an annual report. NGOs must file a yearly report containing the NGO's financial statements, but also details regarding its activities and policies for the financial year being reported on. When must this be filed? Like NPOs, the annual return must be filed within 4 months of the end of the NGO's financial year. There is no fee for filing the annual report. The annual report, when filed together with the supporting financials, will enable the NGO to obtain a certificate of good standing. And this is very similar to the image which we would have shared for the NPO certificate of good standing. So let's just jump over that and look now at the financial information to be filed together with the annual report. The financial information to be provided together with the NPO's annual report is actually determined on a tiered basis. NGOs with revenues of at least $25,000 require income statement and balance sheet prepared by an accountant or bookkeeper. NGOs, however, with revenue above $25,000 require accounts audited by an independent auditor who is appointed in each year by the NGO's board of directors or its committee or governing body. So this must be filed together with the NPO annual report, and it will depend the manner in which it is to be prepared and who is required to prepare it will be determined on a tiered basis based on the income or based on the revenues of the NGO. Like NPOs, NGOs also have compliance requirements with respect to accounts and records. So NGOs must maintain accounts or other records in relation to their business, and this includes not just business done locally, but also that which is done internationally. NGOs must prepare annually a statement of accounts, and the legislation requires that it is done in a format which conforms to the best commercial accounting standards. NGOs likewise are required to maintain accounts and records for a period of 5 years from the date of creation of the record or the date on which the records have been obtained. These include all documents required to be submitted in support of the NGO's application for registration, as well as its accounting and other records required to be maintained by the Act in relation to its business affairs. Additionally, all statements and reports are required to be submitted with the annual report as indicated earlier. They must also maintain all records in relation to domestic or international financial transactions, as I would have indicated earlier. Now, in addition, NGOs must implement accounting and administrative procedures to ensure transparent and proper use of their resources. When I spoke about the NPOs, I gave some examples of some of those accounting and administrative procedures to provide a check and balance on the administration of the programs and activities. So again, having the budgets approved, having the governing committee follow through on how the funds are being spent, following up with the beneficiaries to ensure that they in fact receive the funds, to ensure that the funds are being used for the purposes for which they were obtained, which must be consistent with the aims, the objects, and the purposes of the NPO. And this promotes transparency in the NGO's operations. Now, there are a few other obligations which I mentioned before are short term. Let's take a look at what these are. So there are obligations regarding the qualifications, technical or professional, or officers or employees of the NGO. An NGO whose aims, objectives, and purposes requires require the NGO to possess particular technical or professional qualifications. For example, the NGO may have medical professionals or legal professionals. The NGO must submit to the registrar within 2 months after registration satisfactory proof that its officers and/or employees are licensed under the relevant laws of Belize. NGOs which maintain locally incorporated NGOs, that is, which hold foreign currency accounts with any bank or financial institution outside Belize, must, within 3 months of registration, transfer those funds to Belize and open a foreign currency account in its name in Belize. NPOs must also utilize its financial and other resources for the attainment of its aims, objects, and purposes. Additionally, NGOs are required to train its officers and employees so that they become efficient and professional in delivering the program of activities of the NGO. Now, having become aware of the compliance obligations, both long and short term, it is important to sensitize you on the consequences of failure to comply with said obligations. You should know that an NGO which fails to comply with any provision of the NGO Act, or which is found to be carrying out activities which are not provided for under the NGO's memorandum or articles, is at risk of having its certificate of registration cancelled by the registrar. Now, what are the consequences of a cancellation? Consequent upon cancellation of its registration, an NGO will lose all tax exemption benefits provided under the Act, which I had indicated earlier, the income tax benefits and the relief from other business taxes and the others which I would have elaborated on earlier. So again, it is key that you remember and have recorded your due date for your compliance obligations and ensure that you are on time with your filing. Again, where you encounter any challenges, I encourage that you maintain contact with the registrar and just open a line of communication so that the registrar can be aware of what your challenges are. And where it is possible to do so, indicate what assistance, if any, could be provided. All right, so we want to keep the engagement and the communication flowing because this is in fact a partnership between you, the stakeholders, and the registry and the FSC. All right, so we have come to the end of the NGO presentation, and at this time, we will take 1 or 2 poll questions of what has been discussed, after which we will proceed into the Q&A. And again, Yuri, I will ask you to just, once the polls are closed, to share the relevant results for me.
Sure, Melissa.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. If you're seeing the poll questions popping up on your screen, can you kindly answer? Okay, and after this, we'll still have the Q&A. Q&A segment, everyone. So this is your opportunity to ask any other questions. We have quite a bit of questions that have come in, and we've been trying our best to categorize and document them. However, if we miss a question, if a question requires further elaboration, as stated earlier, please email us the question. That way we can get back to you, and we know who is speaking to us so that we can respond back to you. Just in the question or in the chat, it's hard for us to know who you are. So if you need a response or you need further elaboration and information after this webinar, we ask that you email us at communications@belizefsc.org.bz, and we will respond to your query. Okay, I see votes are still coming in. All right, so let us go over the first poll question, Melissa. My organization is a registered NGO. Should we be registered as an NPO as well? And this is a question indeed that I saw a lot of people submitting this question today. The options were A, yes, all NGOs must also be registered as NPOs. B, no, an organization cannot have NGO and NPO status at the same time. And C, only if the organization meets the requirement of an NPO under the NPO Act. That was the third option. And 66% chose C, Melissa, 25% chose B, and 9% chose A.
Thank you, Yuri. So the correct answer is in fact C. Only if the organization meets the requirements of an NPO under the NPO Act. And again, you will look back at your programs, your projects, your activities. Do they fall within the prescribed categories under the NPO Act? Because if it is that you are a registered NGO and your activities fall within the definition of sustainable human development, and those do not fall under any of the prescribed categories under the NPO Act, be it religious, educational, charitable, social, fraternal, you would not be in a position to obtain registration. And then also think back on the other criteria which I mentioned, being the public benefit aspect, as well as whether or not funds are raised for the programs, projects, or activities. So not all NGOs will be required to be registered as NPOs. It really depends on the scope of the activity under which the programs or projects fall, and whether those extend beyond the NGO Act and now cross over into the NPO Act. If you fall within that area, that category, then yes, you would need to seek registration. So again, to determine whether this applies to your organization or not, we have to go back to the basics. What does the legislation define an NPO as? Do you fall within that definition? And once you're able to answer successfully the three criteria I mentioned, then you would need to seek registration. All right, so I know this was a little bit tricky because the information was just introduced, but as you become more familiar with the material, with the provisions, and refer back to the material, you will be in a position to better meet this determination.
Thank you, Melissa. I do think the participants appreciate that poll question and that explanation you just gave, because as you rightly said, NPO is still very much new to Belize, and it is something that we're all learning. Even on the regulator and the registry point of view, they're also learning. So, you know, it's important for us to ask these questions, provide the right information to clarify what it is and what it is not. So thank you for that. The second poll question, an organization registered as both an NGO and NPO is required to file annual returns under the NGO Act as well as the NPO Act. Is that question true or false? 83% indicated that this question is indeed true.
Thank you, Yuri. I'm happy to hear that. Yes, because dual registration is in fact permissible. You would be registered under 2 acts, and so each act carry its own set of obligations. So notwithstanding that the information may be similar, a filing has to be done under both legislations.
Thank you for
So
that.
thank you for your participation. I can see from the responses that persons have been engaged throughout the presentation and that they have in fact grasped many of the concepts that have been raised and discussed.
Right. So we will now move on to the Q&A segment. We will try our best to cover as much questions as we can. What we've done, we've categorized the questions based on team and also based on the person we want to direct the questions. The team has been doing their best in answering the questions directly in the chat. But if there's further elaboration needed, we can now provide that. I will start off with this question. And this question, I'm directing it to you, Charlene. There's quite a bit of questions when it comes to accounting and statements and being what should go in them, what should not go in them. And then this is something that's very important when you're doing your inspections from a compliance point of view. So I think it is important for us to provide further clarity here. Charlene, are you ready?
Hi, yes, Yuri, you can go ahead.
All right. So this question goes, should grants funds be included in your annual income? And how should that be recorded since these are restricted funds?
Well, grant funds would be a part of the income for the organization. So those.
I think we lost you a bit there, Charlene.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Okay. I was saying that grant funds would form a part of the entity's income, and all their total income should be reported as a part of their annual return, or the annual return as well asks for this information. And in their financial statements, it should be recorded as income as well.
Thank you for that, Charlene. Next question for you. Depending on the size and complexity of an NPO, annual audited financials may take 4 to 6 months. How can this be addressed from a compliance perspective when the law is stating that they need to do their return and submit all these financials within 4 months of concluding their financial year?
From time to time, we do grant extensions for submission of those reports. So as an entity, if you realize that you're unable to meet the time for the report, then you could get that confirmation from your auditor with the expected time for delivery to the report, and you can be granted an extension.
Thank you, Charlene. I will now pose an open question here so any of the presenters can respond. And I saw this question coming up quite a bit, asking for clarity as to what is a compliance officer, who can act as a compliance officer, and how is that different from the other roles. And I believe you had gone over that a bit, right, Melissa, in terms of all these roles?
Yes, I would have mentioned the varying roles to be carried out by the registry versus what is carried out by the commission.
Right. And can a controller, can a director of an NPO also be a controller?
So yes, we don't, however, want to be caught up, as I mentioned before, on titles or labels. But if your organization is a company registered under the Companies Act, most likely your controller will be one of the directors. If, however, the individual is not tied to the director, but he is in control of the management and the direction of the NPO, then based on that role, he could be classified as a controller, albeit that the NPO is not necessarily a company. So we're not so much concerned only with the title of the person, but also the role and function that the person performs in relation to the NPO.
Right. Thank you for that, Melissa. And is there a benefit for environmental protection? This question goes, we wish to conserve a piece of undeveloped land and they want to know if there's a benefit in that type of activity to register it as an NPO.
I believe this is one of the questions that I would suggest be sent via an email so that some further questions regarding the organization can be asked so that the most appropriate answer can be provided, because a little bit more information is in fact required at this point.
Indeed, that's quite something that does require further elaboration. I will now direct this question to BCCAR Santiago. A company NGO that is focused on conservation management of protected areas within Belize would be considered as an NPO. And if yes, does it need to be registered as an NPO even though it is already registered as a company and NGO? So Santiago or Charlene?
I believe that was actually answered. That would
Okay.
have to be up to the organization. If you're already an NGO, we don't have to when, if they were registered, how old they are, if they were registered prior with the FIU, those are the questions. But actually, it would be up to the organization. If you're already an NGO, that would be something that you would have to decide if you want to go as an NPO also.
And I think it also falls into what Melissa explained earlier about the connection between the NGO and an NPO. And, if you have that overlapping requirements, then that is what then guides you in terms of, having both NGO and NPO status. At the end of the day, these are statuses that you hold. And, there's specific guidance in terms of how you constitute yourself and then how do you go about registering for these different statuses.
Hi, Yuri, and also if I may add to that as well, I think a part of the question was whether if they're registered as already with the registry as a company, if they also need to register as an NPO. And the answer to that would be if they fall within the definition of an NPO, then they would need to register as an NPO as well. And so just to be clear, it's 3 different registers that we're talking about. So you would have the register of companies, which would have all the entities that have been incorporated registered as companies. You'd have the NPO register with the list of all registered NPOs, and you also have the NGO register, which would contain, of course, the list of all registered NPOs.
Thank you for that, Charlene. Indeed.
So you can fall within all 3 categories and will be required to be on all 3 registers.
And another question, and now going back to the accounting perspective, Charlene, a question here is asking, do you need to keep separate accounts of NGOs and NPO? If, let's say, for example, you fall under the category registered as both, and both do require you to do financial filing. So do you keep these separate or together?
No, you don't need separate financial reports or financial accounts. The same it's one organization, so the same financial, you would have one set of financials, and those would be applicable as required or as may be required to both NPO and your NGOs. So if you are required to have an audited financials, if you meet the category to have audited financials for both NPO and NGO, then it's the same audited financials that would apply to both.
Okay, thank you for that, Charlene. I'm now going back to you, Santiago. For an organization that is currently registered and up to date with BCCAR as a company, do we need to re-register as an NGO, an NPO? We had previously been registered as an NGO, but not in the new system.
That would fall under re-registration, where every company should have been re-registered by now. So the answer would be yes. And also, if they were previously registered an NGO, have they been filing? So that would be the other question. Just like Charlene said, it's different registered. But yes, they should re-register as a company in OBRS and also be filing their annual returns as an NGO.
Right, and from what I understand in OBRS, if you already registered or re-registered as a company by guaranteed membership in there is a feature for you to indicate and also register and receive that NGO status. And so this is how you go about doing that in OBRS as an NGO. And of course, all the annual filings is also done through the system for an NGO.
Okay, and Yuri, if I might just add to that as well,
Sure.
if they were registered previously as an NPO with the Financial Intelligence Unit, because we know that the FIU was the previous registrar, Melissa would have covered in her presentation that those NPOs and NGOs that were registered with the FIU were automatically included in the register of NPOs with the Belize Company and Corporate Affairs Registry. So they would not need to submit a new application for registration, but they would need to submit their annual returns.
Thank you, Charlene. And with your successful annual returns, then that's when you get your good standing certificate, which I know is important for a lot of people to have, to be able to access all the benefits that Melissa also outlined in her presentation. So a question for you, Melissa, who would be considered a beneficiary?
Okay, so a beneficiary is considered as an individual who is capable of accessing the programs or the projects of the NGO or the NPO. So it's the individual who receives that benefit, whether it be a grant or a donation. And of course, the NGO or the NPO would have identified who are the persons who are capable of benefiting. So for example, if the NPO runs a school feeding program, it would be the actual children at the school. If it's a shelter for, maybe the elderly or persons who are suffering from domestic violence, it would be those persons who actually fall within that category and who receive the benefit.
Thank you for that. So, and this is an open question for everyone. What would be some examples of NGOs we currently have in Belize, and what would be some examples of NPOs we currently have in Belize? And maybe that can further shed some light in terms of the differences that we're talking about here. So, Santiago, would you like to guide us through some examples there?
I don't think I'm following you, Yuri. These are things that we would actually have to check again. And I personally know this is where all the confusion comes around, because we're trying to compare an NGO with an NPO, which the NPO is at. Then we have NGOs that are also registered with NPOs. So it's very difficult to answer something, and I think this would actually create more confusion than what we're actually seeing right now.
Okay. Well, let's stick a pin with that one, and maybe we can consider giving examples when we have some clarity there as well, Santiago. I think it's important for us to also have that clarity happen. So another question for you then, Santiago. What are the things when you register as an NGO, for example, what are the products that you get from the registry? And likewise, if you're registered as an NPO, what are the products you get from the registry? For both registration and annual filing, I think this is something I saw a lot of people asking the differences and clarity on certificate of registration and good standing. And Melissa, you would have shown this in your presentation as well, in terms of how the certificate looks. So the certificate does have clearly outlined the act in which you're registering under. And likewise, when you do your annual filing, the good standing certificate also has clearly the act in which you are acting under. But is there any other thing you would like to add to that, Santiago?
No, again, with the NGOs, everything is done via OBRS. This was something that we had a clear path, and we could actually all filings, new registrations, whenever you're incorporating your company, which is limited by guarantee, and you would also like an NGO, then you can do it via OBRS. And you're right. In return, you would get a certificate as a company and as an NGO. Unfortunately for NPOs, we're not there as yet. These are done via the inquiries email, and we actually we verify everything, the submission, before we actually tell them, okay, this would be the cost of it. And again, whenever they're registered, they will get a certificate.
Thank you for that, Santiago. LaDonna, I'm now coming to you. Here's a question for legal guidance. Can a foreign national be a director or chairman of an NGO?
Good morning, Yuri. Yes, a foreigner can be. The only difficulty you might have there is that this individual would not be allowed to self-register. In order to register, self-register, you will need to have a valid social security cards for all of the directors listed. However, they may seek or retain the services of a registered agent, but they are permitted.
Thank you for that. And just to along the same lines, the question goes, as per the presentation, an NPO can be incorporated or unincorporated. However, if it is a foreign entity being registered, I was informed that they are unable to get such a status, even though this is a philanthropy the organization is operating. Is this accurate information that they
That is not accurate. They would be able to register. If it is an NPO, it would need to be registered as a company limited by guarantee, if it is that they are going to be registering the company in OBRS. And they, like I said, if it's also a foreigner, they would have to seek the services of a registered agent. And I specify a licensed registered agent, please. You can find a list of those available registered agents that are licensed by the Financial Services Commission on our website. Going back to one of your previous questions, Yuri, if individuals in the group would like to see a list of NGOs or who are considered registered NGOs and NPOs, we have both of these lists for the current registrants on the BCCAR website. If you go over into library, it provides the list of NGOs and NPOs, and that can be used as a reference for those who are interested in querying who are some of the NGOs and NPOs registered in Belize.
Thank you, LaDonna. Santiago, someone is asking, is there an annual filing template? when you're doing your annual filing for an NGO?
For an NGO, no, we don't. The NGO has specific things, which would be the audited financials, and actually, again, what is it that you did as an NGO for that year? Those are specific things that when you log into OBRS and you're filing, it gives you the documents that need to be uploaded.
Thank you, Santiago. Okay. I saw quite a bit of questions regarding tax benefits for NGOs. And I saw some of you providing clarity on it. But I don't know if you wanted to restate it for everyone to hear. One of the question goes, are there any tax benefits to an NPO income? And likewise for an NGO. So how do the tax benefits work for either status? So would you like to take up that question, Melissa or LaDonna, in terms of how the tax benefits work and what it means and doesn't mean? Because I see people pointing to individuals, but it really is about the entity, rather the NGO or NPO.
All right, I can provide an answer as far as just to clarify that under the NPO Act, there is no tax benefit stipulated under the legislation with respect to income tax, business tax, or any other tax that may be levied. That is provided for only under the NGO Act. So it's not a benefit that is available to NPOs. It is strictly for NGOs. So just to make that clear.
Thank you, Melissa. So when it comes to annual returns for NPOs, there is a flat rate, as stated before. It is 100 Belize dollars. Am I correct in saying that, Santiago? Registration is 100 Belize dollars for an NPO. Yes. Annual return is 100 Belize dollars for NPO.
Yes, that is correct.
And for NGOs to register that status, what would be the cost, if any?
As an NGO, it's covered under the incorporation of the company, which is the $300.
By guarantee members.
By guarantee,
and then,
yes.
The annual return?
The annual return, again, is covered when they're filing the annual return as a company.
Right. Okay. So I see still a lot of bit of queries coming in when it comes to what do you file and if there are templates. In terms of what you need to file, I mean, the requirements are listed on the website. These are documents that you need to prepare. Your financials, your projections, your project activities. So it's kind of like a report that you're preparing to then submit to the registry. I don't know, is there any consideration to create templates or standardization of these things, team? Is there any value? Do you see any opportunities there?
For the NGOs? No, they actually, I mean, everyone, they have their own way on doing it, and doing
Right.
that. So it would be very difficult for us to have templates.
Right. Okay. So if there is any other question, or if we haven't had time to answer any of your questions, can you please email us? We're here to guide you. The team is here to guide you. I would like to reiterate that you will be able to access this presentation on the FSC website. We will be providing this, and stay tuned. We are going to be publishing other content together with Melissa, we're working with her. We're very grateful for her guidance in providing us in what she's doing, in guiding us in being able to break down and simplify the information that are in the legislations, to be able to provide all the requirements and resources and guidance to you. So we have now reached the end of our webinar. I would like to thank every one of you for tuning in, for participating, for asking questions. And if you have any more questions, please email us. We're here to answer your questions. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your participation, everyone. Have a wonderful day.